So Corcoran Sunshine developed CS Talks to offer a new perspective on development and also to provide the brokerage community with unique access to some of the most compelling personalities who contribute to our business. We're thrilled to be back in person again this year to feature 15 Corcoran Sunshine representative developments across the city. We appreciate your being here, and we hope that you find the experience as inspiring as we do. Allow me to introduce the Claremont Hall sales team. Lori Valvano, give a wave, please. There you go. And somewhere, Alex Siegel, there you are. I'm Sophia Cicciglione, and thank you. And we want to thank our development team, Lend-Lease, LMXD, and Daiwa House for hosting us today. And we have representatives all sprinkled throughout the crowd. I hope you get to meet them and say hello and share a few words. Also, thank you to International House. This venue is absolutely stunning. And I hope you'll notice that from several of these windows here, you look over Sakura Park, right over to the glorious Claremont Hall. So it is my pleasure to introduce you to our panel. It's a lot. So right to my left is Carol Willis, who is going to be our moderator today. Carol is an adjunct associate professor of architecture at Columbia Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation since 1989, and is an architecture and urban historian specializing in the history of American cities. She is founder, director, and curator of the Skyscraper Museum in Battery Park City and won the AIA Book Award for her book, Form Follows Finance, Skyscrapers and Skylines in New York and Chicago. And if she looks familiar to you, it may be that you've seen her on the History Channel or PBS, NPR, or BBC. And next to her, we have Paul Whalen. And Paul is a partner at Robert A.M. Stern Architects and has led some of the firm's most prominent multifamily residential properties, including Celebration, Florida. And that is a town entirely built from ground up. That made me gasp. Heart of Lake in China. It's a new model for neighborhood development that incorporates aspects of traditional Chinese villages, and 15 Central Park West. That must have felt like a cakewalk after those. He's chairman of the board of the Sir John Soane Museum Foundation and a board member of the New York chapter and Congress for New Urbanism. And then we have Sergeant Gardner, affectionately known to many as Sarge. And he is also a partner at Ramsa with an interdisciplinary background in landscape, urban design, and architecture, including the Yards, which is a riverfront neighborhood on the grounds of the Washington Navy Yard Annex, Aris, a LEED Gold development in the Yards, and the Alexander, a mixed-use infill tower in Philadelphia. And Sarge is also on the Board of Trustees of the National Building Museum. And with that, I am going to leave the podium and turn over to Carol, who will be your moderator for this event.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for being here today. The run of the program, I think, is for us to chat a little bit, but then for Paul and Sarge to do a bit of a presentation about their overall context of the history of this neighborhood, of the architectural tradition in which this building fits. And so we thought, because we had a pre-call last week or so, where basically we just sat back and reminisced about our experience in this neighborhood, that would be a good way to start. We have our roots all at Columbia. The Upper West Side has many educational institutions, and so many of the schools that are in this neighborhood, I won't name them all, but have alumni who extend around the world, but have a great nostalgia for coming back to the Upper West Side. At the same time, Upper West Side is it's a big place, but yet it's the kind of one generic name that refers to everything from Morningside Heights and Columbia all the way down to 72nd Street or so. And it's this neighborhood which is not so well known, not so trafficked as part of the Upper West Side, I guess, except for people who went to Columbia. And in the days that we were here in graduate school, when we were talking about I hate to admit it, but the late 1970s, this was a very different place. I know I lived at 560 Riverside, which is just 2 blocks over that way, which was faculty housing for Columbia. I was a graduate student, but the neighborhood was so dangerous that graduate students were invited to live there because the faculty didn't fill it up. And New York has been on the rise since the years of the 70s, which was pretty much a nadir in population, loss of population, crime statistics, and all of that. So, tell us a little bit about your roots in the neighborhood and why this project connects to that.
Well, I went to Columbia University as an undergraduate between 1974 and 78, and little did I know that I was there during the centuries nadir in New York. But the advantage of it, after going away to grad school for a few years, I came back, and New York has gotten better every year, and it's been an amazing time to be here since 1981 full time and see everything get better and better. And this neighborhood, when I lived here, I loved being on the campus, and I loved that there were bars nearby and little shops, and there are actually great restaurants, and that's gotten better and better and better over the years. I used to take advantage of the cultural offerings of the neighborhood, going to concerts at St. John the Divine or Riverside Church, and that's all the same and even better than it ever was. And so this is a kind of homecoming, coming back to this neighborhood and building something. Actually, at Union Theological Seminary, where I used to go as an undergraduate to sit in the Gothic courtyard, because I thought it was so different from Columbia, and it had this sort of, other vibe. It was very quiet in that courtyard, and I would take some books with me on a beautiful day and sit in that courtyard and enjoy it. And I even came to Claremont Park. One more thing. When I started at Robert Stern Architects, one of the first projects, I think the first project I did, was a renovation of this building downstairs. And so that's another, I'm glad to see it maintained so beautifully.
So a little bit of background about myself. My family actually moved to the West Side in 1974 from the Upper East Side. And again, it was quite a dangerous place when we moved here. But one of the really wonderful, iconic sort of memories in my mind of that period for me, my stepfather and I, on Saturdays when I was in the city, we would walk from Central Park West over to Broadway. And we would walk from the 90s down to Fairway, when Fairway was first established, when it was a pioneer. And what's important about that? To me, what's important about that is this project sits on one of the most important north-south boulevards of New York, Broadway. And it is a vital retail corridor of constantly changing characteristic. And it's interesting, as it travels through Columbia University, there are a lot of institutional buildings in the stretch of Columbia University. But then, as it comes by Claremont Hall, it then, again, smaller restaurants reappear. And I'm really excited for how those linkages, the linkages of Manhattan, are strengthening. And to our north at 125th Street, we have a natural, important infrastructure, which is the subway. It is so easy from this neighborhood to get to all different parts of the city. And I'm also really fortunate. My mother studied at Columbia, and my son is now at Columbia. And so when I come to troubleshoot issues about the building on a fairly regular basis, I also have the chance to be with him. And so the last point that I would make is this building is so special because of its context. And because that academic, both as an intellectual context, but also as an architectural context. And we'll talk more about that. So it's really wonderful to return here to this neighborhood for me.
Well, before we do the short presentation that talks about the context of the neighborhood and how this building fit into the parameters, the regulations that were imposed upon it by conditions of the present, because I'm the Skyscraper Museum, I, of course, am an advocate for density, built density, as well as population density. So I wonder if you might talk a little bit about Claremont Ave and how adding density to this particular corridor, which isn't trafficked very much, it's not that much of a walking, strolling street. You have the park across the street. You have Broadway, which is the natural corridor of commerce. But Claremont has been rather an orphan area.
Yeah, Claremont Avenue, first of all, is beautiful. You know, it's amazing. It's sort of like a main street in a college town. But what I would say is that the larger apartment buildings in this neighborhood are a little further down, and they get thinner up here. And so there've always been fewer people on the streets up here, even though it's very, very beautiful. And so it's fantastic that new buildings are coming in, both here and at the Jewish Theological Seminary. This neighborhood needs more residential density. It's going to be great for the neighborhood. And of course, I just want to remind everybody that 125th Street used to feel to a Columbia student like the edge of the world, and you didn't go up there. But now the Columbia campus is stretching up there, and Harlem has changed, and it's not a line where everything changes. Everything continues up. So this is not an edge location anymore. It is in the middle of a really vibrant Columbia University and a sort of an academic acropolis, which is still growing and developing.
Yeah, just to add, I completely agree with Paul. To add sort of another sort of thought into everyone's minds, which is the idea of extension. And if you look at the image, I'm going to steal my own thunder. That image on the screen talks about how this building very specifically roots into the context here, but also the views from this building, especially to the north, extend one's thoughts towards the Hudson River Valley. And this building will have 88 parking spots for bicycles. And you'll be able to, on a Saturday morning, ride your bicycle across the George Washington Bridge. And so what I would say about Claremont is Claremont, as I approached the project this morning, it has a lovely low character immediately to the north, and it's clearly residential. And then our building, actually, the insertion of residential at that location is critical because we're bridging a gap to the rest of Claremont Avenue, which then terminates right at the edge of Columbia University. So we're filling the gap, and I am absolutely unapologetic about density. Density is what is the lifeblood of our city and will do wonders for this neighborhood.
This seems like a good moment to go and kind of explicate the development of the site and the tower and the building.
We start with this image, which illustrates how our building, again, draws very specific character from this neighborhood, and then specifically from this immediate site, which I'll remind everyone is Union Theological. And Union Theological is this amazing one-block context of Gothic Revival buildings that have a very, a beautiful masonry character detailed in a very specific and elegant way. But then again, this image shows how our building, joining Riverside Church, will be a new vertical marker for really the highest point in Manhattan, Morningside Heights. A key concept with this project is the institution that it sits within, and then that's Union Theological. This building will actually is critical actually in keeping Union Theological in this location. Union Theological had a very large sort of deferred maintenance bill and was at this point of decision, can we stay in New York? And really the only way that they could stay in New York was to gain some value from developing this tower. And one other really important aspect of this tower, and we'll illustrate this to you, is that we're actually bringing faculty back to the campus. So this campus will not shut down at 8 o'clock. It will continue to live 24/7. And for us, that's really what a real city is. It's that vibrancy all around the clock. So one also really great thing about working with Lend-Lease and L&M was their outreach into the community and their investment in the community. Significant investments with a number of different local organizations have been made, totaling more than $5 million associated with this project. And I touched on this earlier, but again, the infrastructure modernization of the entire campus of Union Theological could not happen without this project. So here we are in Morningside Heights, and everyone arrived here in a different way. Some people took the subway, some people came in cars. But what it underlines to us as you came to this location is this location has all of the elements of a great city. It has transportation infrastructure in the form of the subway or the Henry Hudson Highway. It has great parks. I mean, they're right outside of our window here. And then finally, it has the dynamic properties of the retail along Broadway, and then the incredible characteristic of this academic neighborhood, which is really actually one of the defining characteristics of this location. So as we've been talking about, this is a neighborhood of campuses. The dominant campus is an incredibly beautiful one, is Columbia University, laid out in a very symmetrical Beaux-Arts fashion. But then on the edges, if you look at the buildings that meet Broadway, so beautifully detailed, with classical detail, masonry, punched openings, very thoughtful way these buildings were designed almost 100 years ago. And then there are other institutions which surround us, most notably, and I'll go to the next slide. We've got some real pedigree in this neighborhood. And most significantly, Riverside Church, which is right next to us. And I have recent memories of arriving at the topping out party, going up into the building and looking out from the building and seeing this immediate context right in your face, this incredible Gothic revival detailing and characteristic of the church right around us. That creates just a unique experience for residents that are going to live and contribute to this place. This campus is a very interesting campus. Union Theological is our immediate context. That's where our building lands. Starting in 1910 and then continuing on into 1928 and then into the 1950s, a really interesting ensemble of buildings was created. Buildings that define the perimeter block condition. So Knox and Hastings Halls do that. They're sort of background buildings that are strong at the street and are 7 to 8 stories high. The whole composition is then punctuated by vertical elements. James Tower, Bonhoeffer Tower, and Brown Memorial Tower. And both James and Brown are landmarked and occupy the key entry corner and the midpoint of the campus. Then finally, 3 quick points that I want to make with this image. As Carol mentioned, the building is built within the constraints of New York zoning law, which is super important because it's designed to make sure that we have light and air for surrounding blocks and the streets below. And so you'll see the diagonal lines that move through that image, that's the sky exposure plane, which required us to set the building back at its crown. Well, we took advantage of that fact, and we composed it in a very elegant fashion, creating an incredibly memorable crown for the building, and set back terraces where people can step out from their apartments and have a beautiful view of the surroundings without a building above them. So the second issue that I wanted to bring up was our relationship, and you can see it very clearly in this slide, our relationship to Riverside Church. We're clearly about 25 feet above Riverside Church. So in doing so, we differentiate the two buildings, but the two buildings, as a result, operate as an ensemble. So with that introduction, I want to give the dais over to Paul, who's going to walk us through elements of the design.
I have to say that for a while, we turned down the project because we were so nervous about building a tall building out of this historic fabric. But after a variety of discussions, we were convinced that it's very important. It was very important to us to save Union Theological Seminary, to keep it here. And we really thought, as a few other people thought, that we would be the best people to do it. But it was scary. I have to tell you, from the very start, it was super scary. We did a lot of models. We were very nervous about what this building would be like and the way that it would fit into this historic fabric. The first thing we decided is to put the building in the northern part of the courtyard. What that does is it leaves the sunniest part of the courtyard open, first of all, to the south views from the building, but also open to most of the classrooms at Union Theological Seminary. We've also set the building back from other buildings on the Union Theological Seminary, which have dormitories, and that way we allow those spaces to still function legally with light and air. And then we located the building in the only place, the most likely place where we could have access to the street, on Claremont. And that's why you see the building pushed to the north and pushed a bit to the west. So, and here you see an image of the adjacent landmarks, but you also start to see how the tower steps up in the way that Sarge described it. Of course, we have Grant's tomb, but the most important tall icon next to us is the Riverside Church Tower. One of the things that we learned many years ago as we designed 30 Park Place, which is right next to the Woolworth building, is that the worst thing to do when building next to an icon is to be at the same height that it is. People often think, well, you have to be lower. But what we realized in designing that building is that you can also be taller. It's, in my mind, always best to just not be the same height, so that historic building is allowed to stand alone. And there's another building that's either taller or lower, and it's kind of telling us a different story. And that's why I think this is successful. And that's why I think 30 Park Place was successful in terms of its height. And it's sort of counterintuitive, but I found that it's true. It really works. And here we look at all the setbacks that Sarge was referring to. Now, every architect in town has to deal with these setback requirements, but I think it's the way that they're dealt with is very important. Here, looking at the west facade, we're not looking at just a series of setbacks, but we're looking at a kind of a layering. It's almost like a variety of different buildings layered on top of each other with subtle setbacks. And it's because we treated each of these elements as a kind of a different building that we get a beautiful stepping down in scale all the way down to the scale of the 3-story seminary. And I have to say that the lesson for us, the lessons for accomplishing a project like this occur on the Upper East Side and the Upper West Side. In the 1920s, in the teens and 20s, architects came in and developed and created taller buildings on the avenues, and they sat next to townhouses on side streets. And those architects, because they were speaking the same vocabulary as the townhouses, they were punched window buildings, they had a lot of the same details, but just they were taller, and they were beautifully detailed at the base. That it's the only city in the world, or this certainly the best example of in the world where that happens brilliantly, or when an architect can go see the lessons of those taller buildings and how they sit comfortably next to lower buildings. So we took those lessons, which have always inspired us, and used them here to create a tower that the original architects could never have imagined would fit here or would ever be built here, but have done it in such a way that we're quite proud really fits into the fabric, because not only does it step up, but each of these building-like element reprises the 3- and 4-story scale of the street. So you can look up and you see 3- and 4-story elements at the top of the building, and you know exactly how big they are because they're 3 windows high, and the Union Theological Seminary is 3 windows high. So that connection and scale is super important to us. Here we are then. This is what the project looked like in a kind of a watercolor before we started. And then after, this is a rendering of what it looks like now in a rendering. But you can see that the subtle stepping back, facing west. And as Sarge mentioned, all those setbacks provide wonderful terraces for what will forever be a protected view of the Hudson River, because you're looking out over a historic church. And that's kind of an amazing place to be in Manhattan, to have a protected view. And as Sarge said, we not only look north, I just want to say that we also look south to the city. And this building is very connected to the city, very much a part of the city. I know that after having gone to Columbia and spending a huge amount of time in the rest of town. But I do love its location as a kind of pivot between being in the heart of the city, but also looking up to places upstate where many people go on weekends. Here then, we have a diagram that indicates how we laid out the apartments by shifting the core off center. You all know that the biggest apartments need to be on the best views. The best views here are partly south, partly west out over the river, and then partly northwest up the river. And they're all amazing views, but of course we put the smallest apartments on the views with the 2 apartments that on the northeast and pure east, where you don't get a direct river view or a sparkling downtown view, but you still get an expansive, dramatic view that will sparkle in the evening. There are rivers to see and LaGuardia's out there. You know, this is a tall building. So those are some of the views. And then back to this overall image. I love that on the left we see how the building sits into the Upper West Side. Central Park is down there. It was very important. We've done some very expensive buildings on Central Park South. We wanted to make sure that those expensive apartments had something nice to look at up here. I think we got that. We raised their values. And we love that, maybe I could afford to live here one day and look down at our other buildings down on Billionaires Row. We're thrilled to be here with you, and we're thrilled actually to have been able to be a part and be trusted with creating a new scale in this neighborhood. Like Sarge, I totally agree that tall scale and next to small scale works beautifully in New York. It's particularly American, by the way. Europeans don't do this. They're nervous about it. They don't allow it in Paris. But it's one of the essential qualities of New York is that there are tall buildings next to low buildings. And what that means is you can get tall buildings with amazing views and low buildings that still allow the light into the surrounding area. That's why I think that transferring air rights in New York is actually brilliant, because it allows tall buildings to go up, amazing views, icons, and at the same time, it preserves lower buildings so that we always have this historic lower scale. It will never go away. Thank you.
I think it's interesting to be here today on the day after the election, because the time for spinning things is over and the time for analysis is here, right? To really understand why things happen. And politics is the art of the possible, as Bismarck said. And building in New York is the art of the possible, right? And you showed us that. You showed us the rationale for the need for a building. You even needed to be convinced of the need for the building. Then you needed to convince Landmarks that the project was the best that could be done with the art of the possible. Could you talk a little bit more about the Landmarks process? Because I'm not sure that everybody really knows how rigorous it is and how much regulation is involved.
So when we started designing this building, one of the things that you do when you're trying to express yourself about a design is you walk around the site and you select key vantage points. And so one of the very first vantage points that we selected was the view on Broadway, looking at Union Theological. And it's very, very convincing. That view, it's a story about, again, I mentioned this before, 7 or 8 story background buildings, which define a perimeter block, and then punctuations. There are actually 3 towers, existing towers, on this campus. Now, when we sited our own tower, we were very careful, and we explained to landmarks. We had a whole sequence of slides that talked about why we positioned it where we positioned it. And we positioned it in the location that we did so that the towers could work together, because there was a precedent for the towers, and they need to work together, and they need to give each other space, and they need to also read from various vantage points in an elegant and sort of symbiotic way. And so we convinced ourselves from those views that the building could sit elegantly on this site. And there are now views that I see of this building. I come across the George Washington Bridge. I live in New Jersey. And I now perceive this tower also as part of a constellation that's growing in Morningside Heights that is complementary. And we're standing side by side with Riverside Church in a really sensitive way. And so I think we were successful, and Landmarks was very comfortable when we met with them that we had solved the problem. And I think one last element that was important was the community engagement that Lend-Lease so rigorously sought. The engaging groups around the project and helping fund initiatives for the local area, so that this building is not just a physical element, it's also a container for people with ideas that contribute and augment the community. So, and I'm sure Paul has also some great things to add.
Just a small thing, that referring to the perspectives that we created. I always think of perspectives as the architect's best friend when going to landmarks, because one needs to remind them that people don't see buildings in elevation, and it's nice to look at the height, the real heights, but that everything is seen in perspective. And when a building like this is set back from the street on all sides, it makes a huge difference in the way that it's perceived from the street. And so when we did, for instance, the view that Sarge is talking about from Broadway, and we could see 2 other historic towers that have been there for 100 years, those towers are so much closer to where you're standing that they're not taller than we are, but they make our building just look like it fits in more than you would think. And that's the story of this tower all the way around, because when you look at it from Claremont, walking down Claremont, the foreground is always the facade of the historic buildings that have been there for 100 years, and our building rises up from those. In fact, we created 2 masses at the bottom of our building that are detailed almost exactly like the historic buildings, so that we can make a delicate connection between our more abstract tower at the top and the more specific Gothic detailing at the base.
Let's talk about both style and materiality a bit. You mentioned windows, and that is also one of, I think, the trademarks of RAMSA, putting a picture window from the inside of the building looking out, as well as fitting it into a facade. But architecture, in history of architecture, associates Gothic style with towers in the spiritual realm, but also in the collegiate realm. And RAMSA certainly has a lot of experience in both of those areas, but especially colleges, Yale and others, more modern campuses as well that you built around the world. Can you talk a little bit how you would characterize the style of Claremont Hall? We talked a little bit, Gothic, classic, what is it? And then especially the selection of the facade materials and the kind of language of color and texture that you thought about.
Right. We were very comfortable with deciding from the very start that we wanted to do a Gothic tower here. But we knew that we wanted it to be simplified. First of all, one can't afford to do a Gothic tower that looks exactly like the surrounding historic buildings. So, what's important about tall buildings is that you see the base from up close, and you need to have a lot of detail at the base. And the best buildings in the world are always designed like this. And then the tops of the buildings are seen from great distances, and they need large gestures that can be understood from great distances, and they can be simpler. And every tall building in town is like that, and we always use that idea on our buildings. The Gothic arches at the top of this building are huge. They're really tall, but they're in scale to what you see from a distance. So it is a simplified Gothic, especially through the top of the building. And I just want to talk about the material, because I think the material that we have, we're so lucky to get. The historic buildings are made out of Manhattan schist. They're all stone, and we knew we couldn't afford it, and we didn't think it was appropriate also for a new tall tower. We liked the idea of using brick, and we hit on a brick mix that I think is so wonderful. And when you look at it up close, it's very abstract. It looks like it might be too busy. There's a lot going on with dark and light bricks. But we kept reminding everybody that you need to step back. You need to step back a block or so and see this and imagine how this is going to carry the texture of that Manhattan schist up the building, but in a flatter way. And I have to say that the finish of the building in that brick blend is one of the things that we're most proud of. And we worked on it hard. We worked on it really hard, but we were also lucky because in the end, you have to deal with brick colors that exist, and nobody's going to make a new brick for you. And so we were able to find bricks from the same company that do this remarkable job of imitating the general texture of that schist.
So just a few quick notes to add to what Paul said. I completely agree. There was, I think it was maybe early in schematic design, we were gathered around in one of our war rooms, and we were beginning to look at early elevations of the building. And very quickly, we agreed that it had to be simplified Gothic, but it had to follow the principles of modern classicism that we have developed in our office, and we're really the world leaders in. Simple ideas like base, middle, top, you have a shaft, but then also localized compositional ideas that Paul referenced, where we have different dynamic massing elements like the bustle, the low-rise bustle, that has a composition within itself. But in doing all of that, it had to have window organizations that also related to the apartments, that didn't try to shove the apartments into a Gothic straitjacket. It had to develop naturally. So that's what we did. And for us, that compositional language of modern classicism or simplified Gothic is also very, very flexible. And what it yields is, when we design elevations, we also step inside and we look very carefully at a section and we look at how the window relationship looks on the interior elevation. And we do that for all of our projects. And then one last thing about the materials, we were thrilled. We traveled up to Canada with the Lend-Lease team. The building is made out of architectural precast. It's colored so that it is a very precise match to, and I'm not sure if it's Indiana limestone. I'm not sure what type of limestone is the original campus is in. But that trim color is so important to the campus in finishing the volumes. And the precast team replicated it brilliantly. So that was a huge success of the project.
I just want to add something about Gothic and its appropriateness, et cetera. I think that Gothic, especially in New York, has meanings that go way beyond universities and religious uses. There's the Woolworth building, which is, of course, it's a commerce. It's an office building that's a Gothic building, so there's that. But also, there are a good number of great pre-war apartment buildings in New York that are Gothic styled. and in particular Venetian Gothic, for whatever reason, is kind of popular. And they're super charming. They're among the most lovely buildings in town, and they're just as nice as getting a Georgian building down the street. It is just one of the places that architects have looked to in the past in New York for inspiration. So there's a residential tradition of it.
So maybe one last question from me before we go to the audience. Could we talk a little bit more about the inside-out design, the apartments themselves, the relationship of the window to the wall, and a kind of traditional approach to the living room, and a post-war paradigm of West End Avenue, and we think of or the Upper East Side.
Yeah, I would say that one of the things that surprises people in our buildings when they go inside is they're surprised at how big the windows are. People don't realize how, when you look at a building from the outside, you see all these individual windows, and they're different sizes, so you know where the living rooms are and you know where the bedrooms are, and that's what makes it look residential. It's what we love about punched windows, because it's another vocabulary or tool that we can use to break down the scale of a big building. But done correctly, when you're inside a room and you have a curtain treatment around the window really looks as big as it possibly could. And one rule that we have for ourselves is that we want our windows to either go to the floor or be about 18 inches off the floor. That's much lower than a typical pre-war building, which would have a 30-inch sill, because they wanted to get a desk or something underneath that window. The problem with a 30-inch sill is that to see the view, to look down, you have to walk up to the window. And that's what the San Remo's like. If I've done renovations there, you have to walk up to the window. It's very important to us that that back window back there has a very low sill, so that if you're sitting down in this room on a sofa, you don't have to go up to the window. You can see down and out if you're sitting down in the room. That's very important to how we design our windows.
Yeah, so a couple things I would add to what Paul has said is, and I love that he mentioned the off-center core, and what that sort of brings to my mind is our floor plate designs and our apartment designs. These are custom designs, and they are adapted to the conditions that we're facing on the site, and also to really get the best suite of apartments on every single floor plate. One other thing I'd like to mention is sort of make a shout out to the Corcoran team, which is really one of the world's best teams to work with on floor plans, because we have a really intelligent team working with us, pushing us to organize these complex floor plates. We're within a sky exposure plane that is very restrictive, and so we had to be very creative. And so that was a great collaboration on this project. As part of our design process, we really wanted to reuse the refectory space. It is one of the New York's most beautiful interior spaces. Its primary characteristics are its width, and then its height, and the historic beams that give the ceiling such amazing character. So we went back and forth, what do we do with the space? And we thought that it would be an amazing addition to the amenity suite. There will be a pool there. It's an important concept, because in adding this building to this landmark site, we have re-energized this landmark. And that space is an example that this is not a fly caught in amber. It is a living, breathing landmark that people are readapting, and I'm sorry to use the word, exploiting this incredible architectural character that it has. I mean, I'm going to sneak in and swim some laps myself. It's just one story of how our team really embraced this context. And I think as a resident, you're going to move through this building, and you're going to think to yourself, this is a place. It is a magical place.
The first Gothic revival architecture was in England. It wasn't in the United States, and it was in the 1700s and early 1800s. And when this Gothic revival came about, it was thought to be kind of curious, but there were interesting people who were interested in it. And they were not looking at Gothic as a dark, spooky architecture. They were looking at Gothic as a kind of an idea of sweetness and light, which later on, when this Gothic revival developed further into Queen Anne, that's the tag that people use for Queen Anne architecture. But early Gothic revival architecture was often all white on the inside or very pale colors, and it was very residential. And so, and it wasn't at all academic. I mean, it was super residential. And so when we did this lobby, designed this lobby, we looked to that early British Gothic revival, this idea of sweetness and light, and it's a white room. And it's something that I think a lot of people won't expect to see because maybe they're not familiar or they're thinking that, this is the Union Theological Seminary, et cetera, et cetera. I think it's going to be wonderful to walk into that space and to have people learn about another quality of Gothic revival, which is this idea of very residential, very pale, and dramatic but comfortable interiors. I think it's for people who love New York. And I think that all of our buildings are designed for people who love New York. There are other buildings that are designed for people who love Hong Kong just as much as New York. But we're very much I love New York people. And this building is an I love Morningside Heights neighborhood. And Morningside Heights, I live in the Village, and I think it's the only neighborhood in the world when I'm in it. And New Yorkers are like that. And so it's wonderful to see you all here. How many of you have never been up here before? Oh, please. Yeah. What about the chickens? New York is, it's wonderful if you all really have been up here. It's fantastic. But New Yorkers tend to not leave their neighborhoods. And I think it's going to be really critical to bring people up here and show them how wonderful Morningside Heights is. I think of it as a university town inside a big city. It's up high, it's surrounded by parks. It is a place like no other in New York. So for us, we were thinking of sort of just people who love what the city's all about. This is an extension of the city. It's just this particular neighborhood in the city.
I completely agree. It's for New Yorkers. But it's also about discovering a neighborhood that's been here for a long time that just has these magical characteristics. And embedding this tower into the institution the way it does, you have a proximity to the surrounding architecture that no one's ever seen before. The students see it during their days, but from our tower, we're going to look at the Teachers College, we're going to look at Columbia, we're going to look at Riverside Church. You're imbibing this incredible context, and I agree, it's for New Yorkers. And New Yorkers, they think a lot, but they like to do a lot of different things on their weekends. So one day, they may walk south on Broadway and walk all the way to Fairway, and then in the afternoon they may hop on their bike and ride across the bridge. And so it also, this project, aside from learning about this magical place, it provides a lot of options because of its incredible location.
I just want to say, by the way, that I think it's not just for New Yorkers, it's actually just for people who love New York. Yeah. Because I can see parents of kids who are going to Columbia who want to buy an apartment for their kids. It happens. People have that much money. Or they want to buy an apartment for their family to come visit their kids. And when people go to Columbia, it's because part of the reason is because they love New York. They want to go to an Ivy League school in New York. That's the only place where you can do that. And so it's that love of New York that we're tying into, whether you're a New Yorker or not.
Neighborhood, is there anything in the building that speaks to that in terms of performance areas or soundproofing in apartments?
I mean, it's flat plate concrete construction, so we'll have very good soundproofing, level to level. There wasn't anything specific that we designed necessarily for music, but what I would say is the surroundings, all the adjacent institutions, the proximity is just incredible. So again, it's the optionality. The swimming pool, we looked at the swimming pool. We have a system that covers the pool. And so again, that's optionality. And we do have a music rehearsal space within the amenity suite. So the answer to that is yes in the building, but also throughout the neighborhood. Maybe I can hook you up with my son. He probably knows also where good music can be found.
By the way, the idea of a pool that with a floor that makes it into a ballroom is something that was invented, I think, in New York and Long Island in the late 1800s, early 1900s, in the huge houses of Long Island. And it was thought of as this incredible luxury to be able to have a pool, but then cover it for your cotillion, once a year. And so I look forward to attending my first waltz here, whenever that might be.
Any other last questions? Yes.
I appreciate your conversation about density and the value of having a tower and added sidewalk space and kind of where this tower fits in with other towers in the area as well. I also know that this is a neighborhood where towers have been heavily criticized, and I'm wondering what kind of opposition you had from the neighborhood and how that was handled.
We had not a whole lot of opposition, actually. And I'm just going to hit another point, which is so incredibly important. Our immediate context, which is Union Theological, this project reinvigorates that institution. And one detail that I would add is, despite the fact that it's a tower, when it meets the ground, not on Claremont, but actually in the courtyard, we've added a critical piece, which is a weather-protected loggia that crosses the courtyard and helps define the southern courtyard. One of the critical aspects of that, and I'm not answering your question, is that now, in a wheelchair, my father was in a wheelchair, you can enter the project off of Broadway and you can circulate into our tower and around the academic spaces at the base of the tower. So, yes, we've added a tower, but we've done it in such a marvelous way that at the base, we've woven uses together and we've corrected problems that existed. And so I just can't wait for it to open, because I want to see how the residences work, but then also how there are going to be 29 faculty apartments in this building. And that is bringing, really important people back to this site. And it could not happen without a tower. So there you go. That's the trade-off. That's the benefit.
Yeah, I would add to that I think that based on the renderings, it was probably very difficult, even though the renderings are quite fetching and all that, maybe difficult for people to understand what the building would really look like. And I have to say, I have 2 or 3 friends up here who I haven't heard from in a while who reached out to me to compliment me in our office on the way that the building looks. And they said that they were really worried about the way it was going to look, but they congratulated us on how much it fits in, and they're very happy with it. Maybe the people that hate it aren't calling me, but just to let you know.
There's a more direct answer to your question.
This seems a perfect way to end, to underscore again that building in New York is the art of the possible. And thank you. And if I could sing, I would start Frank Sinatra, and we'd file out according to the signature song, New York, New York. But I think we communicated that part as well.
I sang that at my wedding. I grabbed the microphone and that. No.
Thank you.
Thank you.